Namaste and good evening, everyone. I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti, Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, welcome you to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered here for a special talk on inclusive urbanization amid the COVID 19 pandemic. Participatory research methodology makes a difference by Dr. Rajesh Tandon. I would like to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay, who is Associate Professor at Vishwabharati University, Shanti Niketan, West Bengal, and Senior Fellow at IMPRI. Sir, the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika, and a very good evening to all of you from Shantiniketan. And just to set the pretext of this city conversation series, let me briefly point out some of the things. Like we all know that our cities are plagued with the challenges around service delivery and infrastructure, and which will likely only worsen as India continues to urbanize at a rapid pace. And this COVID-19 pandemic has put the social and spatial disparities within cities under a magnifying lens like never before. And in recent years, if we see the urban development plan and policies which have been pursued in India, there are two major policy shifts. One is the withdrawal of state and intra-private capital in the urban development, and the rescaling of government from central to local levels, mainly through the process of decentralization, which actually opens up the opportunities for partnership between government and private sector and government and citizens. And decentralization basically promises to bring popular participation and accountability in the local governance. And these governments need support from other urban actors, private sector, NGOs, and community-based organizations to manage these fast-growing cities. And in the development discourse, participation is generally considered as an input to the building of accountability and as an output in the sense of empowerment. And effective participation is reinforcing in nature in the sense that once this process is started, it leads to further increase in the level and scope of participation. But participatory practices are also inherently complex. A public policy decision is not a once for all act. It involves a number of stages ranging from, say, putting an item on the agenda through technical advice, discussion of favored proposals, to enforcement of final decisions. So which segment of population taking part in which mode of local decision-making process and how, that becomes very, very important. And essentially the various factors like existence of well-designed participatory forums, the consciousness and ability of people, the socio-political and the cultural context and the nature of the CBOs, the NGOs and so on affect the outcome of participatory practices. And we all know that the urban governance in India includes a whole range of actors and institutions, and it is the relationship and interactions between them that determine what happens within the city. So therefore, we need an in-depth understanding of the channels and mechanisms of the different participatory processes and their distributional outcomes if we really want to make our cities inclusive. And in this city conversation discussion series, we plan to engage with experts on urban and regional studies to understand such challenges of urbanization and how to make the cities sustainable and inclusive. And today we are really honored to have among us Dr. Rajesh Tandon, an internationally acclaimed leader and practitioner of participatory research and development. He has given a new meaning to academic research by redefining the relationship between the researcher and the research. He has championed the cause of building organizations and capacities of the marginalized through their knowledge, learning, and empowerment, contributing to the emergence of several local, national, international groups and initiatives to promote authentic and participatory development of societies. Dr. Tandon is the founder president of Participatory Research in Asia, the Global Center for Participatory Research and Training since 1982. He is also co-chair of the UNESCO Chair on Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education since 2012. And Dr. Tandon also heads the Forum for Indian Development Corporation as its chairperson. FIDC is a tripartite initiative of the Development Partnership Administration of the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, academia, and civil society organizations. And he also has served on numerous expert committees of Government of India, UGC, UN, Commonwealth, and World Bank. In 2015, the Indian Adult Education Association awarded Dr. Tandon the Nehru Literacy Award for his distinguished work on gender issues. The government of India honored him with the prestigious award in social justice in March 2007. The University of Victoria awarded Dr. Tandon the degree of Doctor of Law in June 2008, and he is the first Indian to be inducted to the International Adult and Continuing Education Hall of Fame. He is the first Indian scholar to be inducted in Academy of Engagement Scholarship in 2019. And today, his title of presentation is Inclusive Urbanization Amid the COVID-19 Pandemic. Participatory research methodology makes a difference. And also today we are very much delighted and honored to have Dr. M. Ramachandran, who is the former Secretary Minister of Urban Development, Government of India, who will chair this session. Just let me give a brief introduction of Dr. M. Ramachandran as well. He is an IAS officer, served the state and central government of India for 38 years before retiring in 2010. Dr. Ramachandran served in various positions, including that of the district magistrate and collector Raebareli. He was the chief secretary of Uttarakhand and was secretary in the Ministry of Urban Development, Government of India for close to 4 years. And post-retirement, he continues to be active in the urban sector and governance areas. He is associated with various national level NGOs in the capacity of chairperson of the Indian Heritage Cities Network Foundation, chairman of the National Urban Transport Awards Committee, chancellor of the ICFA University Dehradun, and senior advisor to the US Green Building Council. Dr. Ramachandran is also a distinguished fellow of Scotch Foundation. His published work include Uttarachal, Ideas That Work, Urban Renewal, Building from the Bottom, Infrastructure and Poverty Alleviation, Delhi Metro Station and Surroundings, Metro Rail Projects in India, India's Urban Confusion, Reforming Urban Transport in India, Issues and Best Practices, and Mavericks of Mussoorie. And today we have also very distinguished panelists. We are really honored to have all of them with us today. We have Professor Chetan Vaidya, who is the senior advisor of Kochi Smart City Project, former director, School of Planning, Architecture of New Delhi and the National Institute of Urban Affairs, New Delhi. We have Professor Jyoti Chandiramani, who is the director of Symbiosis School of Economics, Pune, and also we will be having Dr. Resmi Singh, Secretary, Department of Women, Child and Social Welfare, Government of NCT of Delhi, and Mr. Samir Unhale, Joint Commissioner, Department of Municipal Administration, Government of Maharashtra. So with this introduction, now may I request Dr. M. Ramachandran to chair this session and take charge of these discussions. It's over to you, Dr. Ramachandran.
Sir, kindly unmute yourself. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Samvidip, for that introduction. It's a real delight and pleasure to be in the company of Professor Rajesh Tandon. So without taking too much of time before that, I'll just make 5 brief points to start with in the context of the topic which is being covered today. The first is, of course, the well-known migrants issue. In the whole scheme of things, we realize that there is no voice for the migrants, and in the city governance scheme of things, their requirements have not really been accounted for. And one hopes that there is a good learning as far as the migrants issues are concerned. The second point is about the slum dwellers, more specifically, which became very visible in the city of Mumbai, where they had their own constraints, and that made it difficult for them to handle the pandemic in the most appropriate manner, which should have happened. Very recently, I was having a chat with the municipal commissioner. I was trying to find out from him what made a difference, because to start with, it looked like the pandemic was more active in the slums and it was becoming difficult to control it, contain it. But one of the points he mentioned was that frequent sanitization of the toilets, because large number of them use the same toilet and repeated use makes a big difference as far as such people are concerned. So one strategy they adopted was that to repeatedly sanitize the toilets, and that straight away gets linked to the Swachh Bharat mission, I think. But in the slum areas, the issue must be that of finding space. But toilet for each family, that makes a huge difference. Of course, comes the question of housing as well. So these two fundamentals have again come to the fore, which we really have not addressed in our city governance scheme of things. The third point I'd like to make is about access to healthcare. All said and done, of course, we handled the pandemic well. Some people may say it's all right, we handled in a most appropriate manner, people may say. But then it's a question of there are nooks and corners of the country, especially those who are not privileged, who had problems in getting healthcare and having access to good doctors.
I think
there are some internet issues.
we lost it. Yes. Okay. Yes, sir's connection problem. So let us invite our speaker for today, Professor Rajesh Tandon, to continue. Sir, would that be right? But sir has joined, so we can.
Audible?
Yes, now audible. So please go ahead. Yes.
There was a little bit of a disturbance. The fourth point I'd like to make is about the point I've been making repeatedly, how effective and more useful it would have been if we had some sort of a system at the local level, closer to all our residents, what is called the area units at the local level, which would have had all information relating to people residing in that area, what type of requirements. It could be a person working in a household, it could be a senior citizen, it could be someone who requires a lot of help. So if we have a database and information system and access to that type of a local unit, which in turn can have a close liaison with the city corporation or the municipal council office, and make things possible for persons who cannot move around in situations like this, that would make a real difference. So moving to the what is called the polling booth level and having a proper information base and taking advantage of that in situations like this, not only situations like this, but even normal times when development works are taken up, when service delivery issues are there, that unit could play a very critical role. And that's another aspect we have to have as far as the local governance improvements are concerned. I refer to the repeated point about having areas of house which was once mentioned when the urban reforms were taken up, that did not really materialize. And the last point I would like to make is based on the experience of our preparedness for pandemics of this type. What all have we learned and how do we make it all inclusive? Because there are lessons learned, there are issues which have come up. We handle the situation, but in future, if there are situations like this which are likely to arise, what type of total preparedness? That is something which each city and town has to think about and plan and be ready for. So these are the 5 initial points I would like to make, and I would leave it at that. And I think now I can straight away request our eminent speaker, Professor Rajesh Tandon, to take the floor. Over to you, Professor Tandon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramchandran. Thank you, Dr. Soumyadeep, for your introduction. And delighted to be here this evening with such vast experience of people like Dr. Ramchandran, Professor Chetan Vaidya, Professor Jyoti, and others. And as Dr. Ramchandran said, I hope we learn some lessons from this pandemic in terms of how we design, plan, and govern our urban habitations. So let me share with you some stories, some examples, some questions that we have been trying out, facing, and examining as before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and even at this stage. So thank you very much, IMPRI, for inviting me for this. And I look forward to a very thoughtful and important discussion following my talk. So if Dr. Kumar, you would introduce the PPT, then I will run with it. Okay, thank you. Well, just
Yes.
move on, please.
Yes, sir.
Now, you know, none of you in the panel need to answer this question. But this is a question that haunts us when we start working in any urban area. What is urban habitation? Are these cities? Are these towns? Are these suburban towns? They are counted in the census. If you'll move to the next slide, I'll raise the question about how they are governed. So, Dr. Kumar, move the next. We have corporations, we have municipalities, we have Nagar Panchayats. We have 6,000 plus of these in the country as of last count. But we have nearly 8,000 plus urban habitations as of last count. And when we began to work in places like Bihar and UP, we discovered that there were many Gram Panchayats which were larger than Nagar Panchayats in other states in terms of population. 30, 40, 50,000 population in rural panchayats. And our conversation indicated that their idea of becoming an urban habitation was not really driven by the lure of urbanization, but in fact, the manner in which they were cohabitating there as an extension of a sort of a overgrown village, and other criteria of being an urban habitation like population and size and number of people working in non-agriculture. All those criteria could be met, but they didn't want to become an urban habitation. So when we talk about improvement in the lives of people and talk about inclusive urbanization, we have to say what kind of habitation are we talking about? Because, you know, there are a large number of villages surrounding major cities in any of our parts of the country who actually live off the city economically. They provide services to the city and they spend, if not 24, at least 18, 19 hours every day in the city. They don't get counted as part of the city because they are part of the peri-urban or, you know, rural urban corridor, as we sometimes call it. So the forms of governance vary, and habitations, therefore, how do we make inclusive urbanization in all forms of governance? And the state of Nagar Panchayats, the less said, the better in today's context. Next slide, please. Then we have settlements, which we call in our vocabulary informal settlements. But there are slums. Now, the definition of slums itself is problematic. There are notified slums, denotified slums, slums in the process, which have got, you know, slums which are on public land, which are on private land, which are on defense land, railway land. My Lord, you can't think of the classification there. And a vocabulary which tends to devalue such habitations. Kachi Basti, very popular in UP. Malin Basti, parts of Rajasthan and Bihar use this. The Kachi has a connotation that this is temporary. But people have been born in such locations. You know, generations have lived there. You know, the pavements of Mumbai, families have produced grandchildren on the same pavement. You know, so you can't say it's temporary by any. Of course, it is poorly organized. It is low resource. It is not pakka in that sense that you have you know, mortar and bricks and all that. And then Malin implies dirty, a connotation which is because there is sanitation problem, water problem, space problem. So when we do work in urban habitation, trying to think about inclusive governance, most of the time conversation on slums, counting of slums gets restricted to notified slums, not so much to these other forms of informal settlements or households living informally in formal settlements. How many, even in litigious Delhi, how many households live without a formal address in litigious Delhi? They live in shops, they live in neighborhoods which don't seem to notice them till, of course, the pandemic. And the pandemic happened and they began to come out, and all of us who live in formal colonies with a pakka address were surprised, shocked. We didn't know that there were so many urban informals living around us in our cities, and that they were migrants, but they were serving our communities. So, about 7-8 years ago, I think 2013, in order to make political parties pay attention to urbanization, we did a number of studies in cities around the country to demonstrate that people living in informal settlements make economic contributions to the cities. And our report showed that anywhere from 7 to 15% of cities' GDP was provided by people living in informal settlements. And they were not necessarily only doing informal work. Of course, there are domestic workers, there are maids, there are plumbers and electricians and construction workers. But even drivers of corporate sector were living in informal settlements. And they were making an economic contribution to cities' GDP. And we used that information to sensitize all political parties that you must pay attention to urbanization, in particular, inclusive urbanization. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we are one of the few countries in the world, perhaps the only one, which has a concept called urban village. And I am living in a DDA's formal colony called Sarita Vihar, here near Apollo Hospital in Delhi. And next to me is a place called Madanpur Khadar, which is a village and so-called Lal Dora land, where 6 to 7 story buildings have been constructed. The DDA colony is only 4 stories. And each flat there has no more than 80 to 100 square feet of space, being rented out at 4,000 to 5,000 rupees a month. None of the flats have any toilets. The owner of that area has got a community toilet at the ground floor. So if you're living on 7th floor, you have to go down and use the toilet. Winter, summer, night, day, doesn't matter. So we have legal colonies, but a large portion of our population lives in so-called illegal settlements. And Delhi High Court and Supreme Court have been creating these committees, and I'm sure these committees exist in many other cities, trying to figure out what is illegal use of legal colony through commerce, through industry. There are chemical factories operating out of residential colonies in Delhi. So when we talk about inclusive urbanization, we have to take all of these categories into mind, and not just formal legal colonies. And it is the formal legal colonies which tend to have RWAs, Resident Welfare Associations. And these RWAs during the pandemic and even now continue to behave in the most dictatorial manner, making rules about who can come, who can go, and ensuring that all the informal workers, like domestic workers, like drivers, we have a story from a RWA, from a gated community, where the driver cannot stay in the colony, driver who drives Audi of the boss, if the boss is in his house. So driver has to go out, park the car, go out, stay out of the colony. Where will he stay? Where will he stand? And then the owner will phone him, he'll come inside, start the car, and the owner will say, go out. So while the people living in informal settlements are serving those living in legal and gated colonies, the rules of the game are not the same. Some made formally and many made informally, even the rules. Next slide, please. So how do we know who lives? How do we know what exists? In the last 5-6 years, we have done some intensive work in 3 smart cities. Ajmer, I think I've told that story, Dr. Ramchandran and Professor Vaidya earlier, my colleagues as well. We have got great support and advice from them as through this project. In Ajmer, in Rajasthan, in Jhansi, in UP, and in Muzaffarpur, in Bihar. And so our focus was how can we have inclusive urbanization, but riding on the Swachh Bharat mission, because in 2016-17, Swachh Bharat mission came in a big way. And how can we ensure that all urban households have access to toilet? That was our driving motivation. So we went around and we collected ward maps because we want to know how many wards are there. Now, of course, you could count the wards, but you couldn't get maps of all the wards. You could get a map of the city, which was at least 20 years old in some cities and 10 years old in some others. And cities' boundaries had shifted and the map didn't exist. So our team had to travel throughout the city and identify wards and ward maps and ward boundaries. But then came the question of mapping habitations. In each of these cities, we discovered that there were at least 30 to 40% more habitations than were known to the city. So we mapped habitations. You can see how we mapped this through methodology. In order to map habitation, we had to lean on people living within the habitation. We helped develop a sort of a settlement improvement committee, a sort of a local household people, young women, adolescents, and trying to get them together and say, well, tell us who lives here. Map the habitation, mapping the facilities in the habitation. What kind of infrastructure is there? Water source, garbage collection system, any schools, and social infrastructure like temples, mosques, shops or shopping areas, etc., etc. And then we also, with their help, mapped services. You know what they were getting: water, sanitation services, were any. So this kind of a mapping of geography, mapping of institutions, and mapping of services through the method of participation by involving residents of the community. So we map the context, map the location, map where they live, map what exists where they live, in order to know, first of all, what they are accessing, getting, what they are not. But nobody could tell. So in a way, the mapping helped each of these municipalities because they had asked the state and central government only so many toilets based on their old data. Now 30-40% more informal settlements and households data came, so they were able to approach central and state governments and officials like Dr. Ramchandran, encourage them to, okay, you use more money, but make sure it is inclusive, because don't leave any households or any settlements without toilet facilities. Next slide, please. Now, then the question comes, who lives in these habitations? And that is also not an easy answer. Huh? You can't say citizens live. All kinds of citizens live. So if you look at it from the place-based concept, the spatial concept. So those who have confirmed postal address, I have confirmed postal address. Those who have address-based identity cards, PDS, voter, driver, various types of identity cards are there. But they don't have a fixed place. So, for example, when my maid or my driver wants to apply for a new SIM card, they use my address because they don't have an address. They don't have an address. And you need to give an address. So they give my address. In fact, 4 or 5 years ago, one electrician who used to service this area in our colony, he wanted his son to get a passport, and he applied for it, and he asked us, can we give our address? I said, look, I have seen your son, but you don't live here. He said, sir, I'll speak to the policeman. So there are a lot of people who have identity cards, but it is not place-based. They don't live in an address. Then there are, of course, those who are without identity card, but they are known to the first two categories. This is the category of people who were most insecure during the lockdown and have continued to be so. Domestic workers, women domestic workers. We have been working with women domestic workers in South Delhi and in Gurgaon. And these women domestic workers helped to do a survey of other women domestic workers in 2 colonies, one in Gurgaon and one in South Delhi, as soon as the lockdown began. Their own data seemed to indicate that forget the salary of April, they didn't even get salary of March. Then came June and July, and as opening happened, there were restrictions, they were not called back. And if they are running out of food, and of course their children have no access to online education either, then they were able to mobilize and communicate because they had done a survey themselves. They had done participatory enumeration of the urgent food-related, survival-related needs of domestic workers themselves, because the rest of us didn't know. They were locked out. And many of them do not even have any ID cards. Sometimes their husbands had, sometimes their husband were locked out somewhere else. Suddenly when the lockdown happened, they didn't have. But these people are known. So they are known to those who employ them. They are known to others who live with them or in that neighborhood. But they lack formal identification. And then, of course, vendors, tea stall, this country must be having at least 10 million tea stalls, all over. And, women who are selling vegetables, people who are, providing food, or on a cart, they're selling fruits or vegetables, whole bunch of these people, they were suddenly became visible due to the lockdown. And many of them lived in settlements which were never enumerated, never mapped, and nobody knew exactly what Dr. Ramchandran was saying. In the absence of settlement-based or polling booth-based data, nobody knew. Our Resident Welfare Association did not know how many people have been doing ironing in the colony. You know, their ironing makes us wear pressed shirts. But we didn't, our IW didn't know. Nobody knew how many. We just didn't see them for 3-4 months and were worried whether they were hungry, but we didn't have an address for them. They're just sitting there, you go give your clothes and you collect them. A lot of, the food suppliers, you have shops in the neighborhood and then you phone them and then young boys come on cycle and give you food. Pre Amazon model, more homegrown model than Amazon model. Now suddenly this disappeared. Now there was no way to find out if they were hungry, if their families were hungry, if they had any money, because we didn't know where they were. We didn't know. Next slide, please. So we, in each of these cities where we go, we start doing this participatory settlement enumerations. And how we do it is we get the younger people in the households, in the settlement, in colonies, get them trained. Now we have got them trained using mobiles and, basically mapping the settlement, counting the number of households, counting how many people live there, just collecting data. And also having subgroup conversations, as you can see from some of these photos, the young men, young boys having a conversation about what they are experiencing. Women are having separate conversations. So this kind of subgroup conversation, you can see these young girls have drawn a map of their settlement and that they place what infrastructure exists where and what is missing. So, and one very interesting thing with these women on the right hand side, you can see this we did with domestic workers. Participatory transact movement tracing, where they live and where they go to work. And some of the domestic workers may work in 4 or 5 households, not just one. They're not full-time living in a household. So what do they do? How do they get there? What obstacles they face? Who harasses them in between? Who extracts some corruption charges, etc., etc. So these methods involve them in collecting data, and while they're collecting data, you can see they're having conversation. They're discussing what does it mean, interpreting. And in each of these cases, we were able to then share this information with the councillors, with the municipality, with the commissioner, and in all the cities, this participatory enumeration, the municipalities put it up on their own websites, and they were able to use it to more targeted services. And we, as I said, focused on Swachh Bharat mission because we wanted them to access toilets and also the collection. Now, during the pandemic, these settlement improvement committees, when they got locked down and nobody could go there, they were the ones, because they were organized and they knew the settlement, they were helping each other. And they were able to connect with the councillor and with the municipal commissioner and with the municipality office to say some households need, food, some households need hand washing, because they were organized and they knew who lives where and what do they need. And this made a lot of difference. In all these informal settlements, nearly 200 plus, 250 plus in these 3 cities, nobody went hungry. Nobody went hungry. But we can't say the same thing. I can't say the same thing about my own neighborhood, my own ward here in Delhi, because such informal settlement organizing had not happened. Next slide, please. So, last slide. How do we know what we don't know? And I'm given my own electronics engineering background, my heavy duty playing with computers when I was 20 years old or whatever in Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. I am not against data, but big data doesn't answer everything. And big data has been promoted because it tends to locate citizens as consumers, not as those needing services, needing support, needing housing, needing rental housing, needing water, etc. Then we have the problem with government data. We are using 2011 census. Hopefully 2021 census will come, but by the time data will be available for cities, it will be 23, 24. And it is incomplete because, as we discovered, a third of the population is left out. Urban habitations are dynamic conglomeration. They are growing, they're changing, boundaries are changing, people are coming and going, mostly coming, different types of people coming. So the dynamism of this urban habitation needs to be captured. And that is why granular data is required, but it requires intensive micro-local engagement. Without that micro engagement, we won't be able to produce granular data. And finally, whenever we go to these communities, we engage and involve them in enumeration, they always ask us, what for? Have you come here to give us something? Have you come here to count us for some other purpose? And of course, of late, citizenship fears and all that kind of stuff. So they will participate in enumerating, documenting, mapping, organizing when they see their own well-being, their own improvement in their own lives as the purpose. So when you have shared purpose, it is essential bedrock for participation. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dr. Tandon, for your very interesting presentation. It's really illuminating for all of us, especially for those who are like me, who are doing, or actually were just at the very beginning of our career at doing something on participatory research, just try to, because I have the experiences of working with the ward committees of West Bengal. So if time permits, I will share some of the experiences of how the ward committee performs, especially in the context of West Bengal, which is actually recognized as one of the leading state in terms of participatory development and progress, and how faulty the ward committees are in West Bengal. So anyway, so just let me now request Dr. M. Ramchandran, if you have your remarks or observation on what Dr. Tandon has said.
Thank you once again. The hard facts and realities have been listed. Now, one of the fundamental questions which come to my mind is, Dr. Chetan Vaidya knows me. We were in the process of, all the time we were arguing for strengthening local governments and local governance. Now, the 2 points which he mentioned, I'm just picking up certain points only, not the entire issues which he has listed. One is the illegal colonies which have come up. Now, I recall, I think Professor Chetan would have heard me any number of times, a city like Delhi, the capital city, the national capital, has only some 40% of construction which was authorized. The balance is either unauthorized plus slums. So the very fact of local governance which we want to strengthen, have they been able to rise up to the challenge of providing proper governance systems at the local levels? I think almost all towns and cities have this problem of illegal constructions. Then if they get regularized at some stage, slums come up because people have no place to go and stay. So they have to willy-nilly go to a slum and provide these very valuable services, which Professor Rajesh Tandon very rightly emphasized. I mean, I also have a guilty feeling most of the time. The driver, poor fellow, comes from somewhere. One doesn't know what type of existence he has. He works late, and when we have privileges like we can go and get our work done during office hours, daytime and all that, when he has to get something done, how does he manage that? That's where I think at least if the pandemic has given us the lesson of at least making a beginning as far as what Professor Tandon referred to as the data at the local level. I mean, I envisage a situation in a population area of 1,000 or whatever it is, everyone has his or her detail provided to a local office. I would ideally think it's a local office of the local body, and people there know. I mean, I know my neighbor. We all know who are all coming into our area, coming for work, household work, for doing drivers work and things like that. And where are they staying, what is their scheme of things, and within our own area, who are the type of people who do not have that type of access. There could be some slums, and as Professor Tandon rightly mentioned, the sabjiwala who comes, or the ironing fellow who is always seen in the colony, all these people, we have to have some sort of basic data about these people, so that in situations of emergency problems, their requirements are also taken into account. The other point is, this is another dilemma we all seem to be facing. He referred to the large census towns, which are not really towns, but actually villages. And as he rightly mentioned, there are 40,000, 50,000 population villages, which are in the census towns category, but they are not urban areas. Do people want to be urbanized in that sense? Do people want to be in a formal notified urban area? I recall again the old thinking that rural programs were much more beneficial than compared to urban programs, where you have to pay property tax, this tax, that tax, you have to run from office to office to get things done. You are not recognized properly in a village. It's much different. So there are many places, especially in some of the states you referred to, where people like to continue to be in villages because that's a better proposition. So again, a challenge for governance, especially urban governance. Do we really want villages to be converted into urban areas and then only pay more taxes and struggle for service delivery and things like that? The GDP contribution you referred to, I mean, whatever our economic system or economies and all the theories which we have, if we have failed to account for their contribution and you have failed to take into account their role, then again governance has been a substantial failure. I again used to say, Professor Vaidya may remember, if Mumbai has more than 50% population living in slums, Mumbai should actually be governed by representatives of the slums, not by the less than 50% of the others. Probably they'll be able to manage things better as far as issues, problems of slum dwellers, which is a large segment, is concerned. So these fundamentals have always been there. They are there. We fail to be addressing these issues and we shy away from that. We give a sort of a pretense of, oh, we have very good local governance systems and we have great revenues. We should issue municipal bonds, this, that, and all that. But again, to extend Professor Tandon's argument, of course, now there is some emphasis. Can we confidently say that in each city, each
Some glitches, some glitches again.
Oh. Yes, I think there are again some connectivity issues.
Yes, sir is also in hospital. So,
Oh,
sir,
okay.
why not we start our discussion also? Soumyadev,
Sir is
please.
here. Sir is
Acha,
here.
Okay.
Yes,
okay, okay. Then I think, yes.
Ramachandran sir, can you hear us? Again, we have.
Okay, I think we have,
I think,
yes.
yes, sir. Sir has
It's been
rejoined.
disconnected or rejoined. Okay.
Yeah, I think I'll stop at that. Probably it's a reminder that I shouldn't make another speech. So who would like to take this forward, Dr. Samidhi?
Yes, please. So thank you, Dr. Ramachandran, for your insightful comments. And I think just to add to what Dr. Tandon and you said, like you already talked about the inadequacy of the official data for understanding who lives in the urban cities and who are actually the makers of urban cities, and also the problems of illegalities and informalities which are associated with these urban habitats or urban settlement. So based on my research, what I also think is that politics at the local level also plays a significant role in determining which settlements get included in any sort of urban development programs. For example, we all know the plight of the migrants, but these migrants, they do not form the political constituency. So they are ending up being completely unrepresented in the urban decision-making processes. And in the absence of, so as to say, the voting rights in the cities, these migrants are stripped of any opportunity to assert their political agency, to make their demands, and within the entire city governance system, and to stake claims to the public entitlement. So this is another important issue which I think is also important. So with these comments, let me now request Professor Hitesh Vaidya, Professor Chetan Vaidya, to make your observation or comments.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes, thank you. Yes,
Dr. Chattopadhyay, can you hear me? Can you
yes,
all?
please. Yes, yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Tandon, Rajeshji, for that insightful presentation and making us conscious of need for micro engagement. It's so important in our planning processes. And also, Dr. Ramchandran sir has given such a nice background to this, and I thanks IMPRI for this opportunity, particularly Arjun. Now, I think in addition, I'm putting it in addition to participatory medal, we should all try for stronger local governments, I think. If we don't do that, if we have only stronger participation and not linked to strong local government, somewhere we'll miss the bus. And in that context, I work in Kerala. Of course, sir has much more experience in Kerala than I have. But I will like to speak about experience of Kerala, where there is a very strong local governments. It's all very well documented. And the sub-center, the health hub centers are managed by local bodies. The schools are managed by local bodies. When I say managed, they have a role in there. 30% of the overall budget is spent by local bodies under a people's program. And this is happening since 1996. So now the whole system is well set. Everybody understands how that money has to be sent, what are the do's and do not. And then parallelly, there is a women's group, self-help group, which is called as Kudam Shri. It's very active and doing many kinds of things, skill development, construction, managing shops, and whatnot. And they are very effective in service delivery and information. And in Kerala, unlike many other states, the Kudam Shri workers work with the local body representatives. There are conflicts, but they also work with them closely. And I am told, this is just a number I'm mentioning, 30% of the women representatives this time in local bodies were formerly or presently working with Kudam Shri. That means 15% of the elected people in local bodies of Kerala present have some context work with Kudam Shri. And Kerala corporations, municipal corporations do not have a strong commissioner Raj system. They have executive mayors. Actually, I work in Kochi and I meet the mayor more often than I meet the secretary. And when the new elections took place in Kerala, I was very keen to, I'm still very keen to talk to the mayor, which doesn't happen if I was working in Surat or Ahmedabad. I have more concern to deal with the commissioner. So we have executive mayors who actually are very strong. And then there are ward level vigilance committees were set up for COVID-19. There were participation of the local representatives in these ward committees, participation of the common man, NGOs, and other funds. And they worked on delivery of services like food packets and medicines, identifications of potential patients, tracking them, helping them, identifying outside workers. So at least in first two phases, Kerala Urban did very well. Of course, the third phase situation was not good. As far as migrants are concerned, in Kerala, they are called guest workers. They are not called migrants. And, you know, the way they tried to help them, it's very interesting to see that they were given First, they were given cooked food, which many of them from Bihar and UP didn't like cooked food. So then they were given a stove or something to cook their food, and they were given wheat-based activities. Atta was given for cooking and vegetables. And they realized what they need. One of the things after food they needed was recharging SIM cards. It sounds so, now when I look back, it sounds easy, but they found out they needed recharge SIM to tell their families back home in UP or Bihar or wherever they are from that they are fine. Did simple things like carom boards. I mean, they don't cost much, but this is the kind of thing, and of course, that is how they help. And this was obviously a very, very well-practiced method of centralized, decentralized system of governance. I think extremely important, along with the micro. And then there are examples. I want to mention another example, completely different, from Kalyan Dombivli. I think this should be, very little is being written and talked about Kalyan Dombivli. It's a big city between Thane and Bombay, and it loses its importance because of that. They did a lot of things at decentralized level. They had decentralized ward level vigilance committee. They had decentralized war rooms. I mean, those huge integrated command and control systems called war rooms at the central level in 45 smart cities are there. This is important. But in Kalyan Dombivli, they did it at ward level with the councillor as vigilance committee member. And they started what they call as 24-hour social web program, where they started with yoga in the morning and added with music system in the end. And in between they ran what are the services, how to get the ambulance, how to get COVID tested and other things. So these are interesting examples. And I think all that link with, if they had the very strong micro engagement, the way Rajesh ji said, it would have been extremely good, much more effective and efficient. So with that, I will end my comment. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Vaidya. And let me just move over to Mr. Samir Unale, who is the Joint Commissioner, Department of Municipal Administration, Government of Maharashtra. If you please make your comment and observation on today's discussion. It's over to you, Mr. Unale.
Samir sir, can you hear us? You are on mute.
Sorry, hello.
Yes, please.
Am I audible? Hello.
Yes,
sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Perfectly audible.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, actually, I'm traveling. So first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity, Arjunji. It is always a great honor to interact with Rakesh sir. Of course, Ramchandran sir was leading the India's urbanization efforts in the GNRM era. So it's always a great honor to be with them in the same webinar. Regarding, I think it was an eye opener in the discussions, which was whereby people's perceptions or the phenomenology of cities, if one might add, does gives a very different perspective and does gives a very different connotation to how regular administration is happening, and the limitations that are glaringly coming out of this approach, if one might take. One have to realize that the India's urbanization is huge. I mean, we may be telling that we are just hardly 32% of the urban population, but in absolute terms, we have got 8,000 census towns and 4,000 statutory towns and urban local bodies, and the combined might is the third largest, bigger than the third largest country of the world. So this any analysis or discussion in Indian cities and Indian urban system would always be a limited or partial statement due to the sheer range and sheer variety that we see in Indian urban system, for that matter. Regarding limited point, I would like to just suggest that use of technology in cities is just not limited to the concept of smart cities. I mean, somehow it of course was there's a rising perception that if any technology in city administration or city living is only with smart cities, which is not the case. They are supposed to showcase and lead the road ahead of what can be done. But a lot of things are happening in smaller cities. A lot of things are happening in simpler cities which are not getting reported or maybe are not getting discussed in webinars or academic discussion. But I think that is one limitation that is coming up, especially in social sciences vis-a-vis Indian studies, that the documentation is not very strong, and therefore a very limited aspect of very limited cities come to forefront, and that is normally discussed. During pandemic time, I was working both sides of Kalyan. I was first the CEO for the Smart City Thane, and then I worked as Municipal Commissioner for Ulhasnagar, which was adjoining. And let me tell you that the entire Mumbai region followed the similar model in the pandemic, because there were constant collaborations and discussions among each others. Sir already mentioned about the smart city control room, and the ward-wise control room was a common feature in entire MMR. Even Mumbai, for that matter, and Dharavi also replicated that, and there was very close collaboration amongst the political leadership. Is, I think, is very important. Somehow we miss them out in any academic discussions, because the ability to connect with people is the core competency of any politician, and therefore what they can connect and achieve is something fabulous, and that needs to be garnered and harnessed for any such measures when we are interacting in maybe COVID or other emergency or disaster management practices that are followed. On the use of technology apart from the command control center, I think the shift to technology using digital tools, even in the informality and the poor section, was very fast. In Thane, we had started a Digi Thane app, which is an app. The city of 2.5 million has almost 3 lakh registered users in that city app. I think it's one of the very rare apps which is getting used, and it is unbelievable that the traction this app got during the times of COVID. When the last count is talks of almost more than 4 crore engagements in the city on this app. If the city of 2.5 million, then you can imagine how much it was getting used. And so I think with ease with which the people are adopting technology is something that needs to be acknowledged. It is not that it's just a fancy of technocrats and IT experts who are just selling their IT hardware. That's not the crux here, but the sheer need and the with ease with which people are now moving and adapting using digital technologies for the day-to-day interaction with cities is something, is a matter of inevitability, I believe, because it is very useful, it is convenient, and people will start anything which is useful and convenient, which it might be technology otherwise, and therefore the digital divide that we are talking is slowly breaking. We have also had tried a city free Wi-Fi at the city level during this time, in which downloads up to certain level were made available on this app. And so what I think is a limited point, because I know it's almost more than 7, so I won't be taking much time here. But the point I would like to really suggest here is that technology exists in cities, irrespective, even if they are smaller cities, if they are not smart cities. So that's point number 1. Secondly, the people are accepting and using technology very easily, very smoothly, and the elements of I mean, we will have to focus more and more on making these things applicable. The sizes of our cities are becoming so much that without use of technology, it will be unimaginable and untenable to survive in cities also. Third aspect was of urban poor and use of technology for them, whether it is feasible or whether it's just a pipe dream. I mean, the very good example was made that recharging of the SIM cards when during the time of COVID and that era. Hopefully, we have been very resilient. I personally feel we have been very resilient in the times of COVID, that we have adopted and we have picked up and also changed our way of functioning it quite ease and with quite strength. And I think we are much stronger now to face any such disaster that might strike than what we were earlier. And the core strength is essentially the ability of the common people to connect, and the ability of common people to rise up to the occasion and face any situation they might be coming up. At administration level, what needs to be done, I believe, is getting connected with people more and more, and engaging with city is not essentially a political function. Knowingly, unknowingly, I always feel that the narratives of urban India get either of land use planning by the planner community, or of the political dimension, the activists or the political scientists. But living in city is just not these two things. It is much more than that. And the narratives of the city need also to be developed in the other dimensions, which still now have not yet been appropriately addressed or appropriately discussed. So, Arjunji, that was my very limited point. And thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a great honor to be a part of any deliberation where Ramchandran sir and Rakesh sir are part of it. Thank you, Arjunji. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Samyadeep, sir.
Yes, thank you. And just let me quickly move over to Professor Jyoti Chandramani for your comments or observation. It's over to you, Professor Chandramani.
Ma'am, please unmute. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Samyadeep, and thank you all the panelists for sharing your wonderful thoughts, because it gave me the opportunity to collate everything together. So one of the pointers that really touched me a lot was what Chetan Vaidyaji said, about how in Kerala they refer to the migrant as guests. I think the need to be extremely sensitized to the migrants was absolutely a need of the hour. And the fact that there is this coming from the government and coming from the machinery that governs is a very, very good move in the right direction. We've been talking about SDGs. Before SDGs, there were MDGs. And before that, we would talk about the PQLI, etc. We've talked about all this. We talk about leaving no one behind, but really sensitization came to the core, because you didn't, barring the fact that the migrants really walked back, but those, the poor who were in the slums, I think somehow or the other, there was some kind of agency cohesion. At least I can say that in the region of Pune, Thane, Mumbai, that I have been following very strongly, because I come from that region, that there were very strong agency cohesions between, as our earlier panelist also talked about, Sameerji talked about, that there were collaborations, there were war rooms, there were these, communications that did help. And that was what was very important. Anecdotally, I can tell you that my own driver with his 3 kids and wife were all detected with COVID. And I would call him up every day. And what he said was that he then moved into a government created shelter in a school where he felt he was very well taken care of before he moved in. He was comfortable. The food was very good over there. He had no complaints coming back. I think that itself spoke a lot about situations. So that was one. The next is agency cohesions, as I talked about, that was one. The next is, how can we ignore census towns and large villages, 5,000 of them that we, villages and large villages with population of 5,000 plus. I did a little study of Daund, taluka of Pune. And when I went there, right from the highway that goes there, which keeps changing, the COVID was well managed, but what the students and the other fraternity out there turned around and said, they said, we have no open spaces to play. We have no governance systems out here. There are no additional schools. So what was coming up over there was drugging was increasing. There was the matka gambling. So when there is a lack of creation of the 18 functions of an urban local body in places which look urban-like, but are just relegated to be able to come up on their own, I think that proves a very, very big challenge. If it is unaddressed, then I would say we are being Janus looking one way and ignoring the other. And therefore, what's going to come out is going to be a very palimpsest kind of an approach where unregulated, planning will take place, and then you would find to set that right, you would be in an issue. So with COVID, what has happened is that the health systems have definitely got pulled up. There is no doubt about that. We have managed well globally. But when you look at cities, the migrants is something that keeps staring into the face, that how you're going to be able to manage this the next time about it comes in. Agency cohesions was my fourth point. And the fifth point that I want to make is data does not tell you the true story. It is actually, when you look at big data and you look at ratios and proportions, it's just what is the numerator and what is the denominator. So this gives you a great big picture, but the ground realities are completely different. So I agree with Rajesh ji on this point, that big data doesn't give you the real picture, and that real picture really requires foot soldiers who go down to level and see what the research is at the ground level. So these were some of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chandramani. And then just, I think, would you be like, Professor Dr. Tandon, would you like to respond to the comments made, or we may invite, or we may request Dr. Arjun and Dr. Simi for, if they have any question or observation, and then you can answer at the end.
Sir, you are on mute. Yes, please.
No, I think there's nothing to comment on. This is all convergent.
Okay.
So thank you.
Simi, please go on then.
Simi, yes. It's over to Dr. Simi, who is the director of this IMPRI.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Soumyadeep, and thank you, Dr. Tandon, for such a wonderful presentation, and all the panelists for making remarkable insights. So my point of view is on the basis of a political scientist, as I am trained in political science. I would like to point out a couple of points. First is that we actually have a threefold distinction when we talk about various models of democracy. For example, it is responsive, participatory, and deliberative, where each of these models tries to influence, it also seeks to attempt direct decision making, as well as foster political discussion and also participation. Secondly, it is also argued that each of these models are associated with different desired consequences of political participation. For example, equal representation of interests, or even equal protection of interests, then self-development, and also some sort of subjective legitimacy that can be attained through this. However, I feel that the problem that arises is that these different approaches in participatory planning, it stems from the argument that stresses on a certain type of democracy, and this has actually been prescribed or argued also by political theorists like Tocqueville and also J.N. Knudsen, where they say that where each of these model provides participatory conditions, yet they always do not become a reality. There is certainly active level of citizen participation, and then enabling mechanisms are there for voicing and expressing challenges and solutions. It becomes perilous when once political populism occupies the center stage. So given this kind of a puzzle, I am compelled to ask Dr. Tandon, what are your views on navigating through this? And another question that I have is that how do you juxtapose this whole participation and participatory research methodology with ensuring that the safety of vulnerable population, women, children, and the elderly, is assured, and that crime and corruption, because this goes along with a democracy. So how what are your policy recommendations on the way forward? So if you could, so that we can have really impactful dialogue and impactful policies at the end of the day, if there is some optimism.
Well,
so
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
There are, first of all, I mean, I was deliberately not focusing on decentralization and local governance, partly because we have other experts talking about it. And secondly, I wanted to focus from the citizens' point of view. Without effective decentralized governance, we cannot talk about citizen participation. But corollary is also true. Citizen participation makes local governance effective by demanding, by voicing, but also by holding them accountable. And in these examples that I was giving you, even councillors who were elected by many of these people who voted for them did not know really whether settlement level requirements were to services, whether there were new population joining the settlements, etc. So when people's own agency is collectivized in these settlements, then they become actors in not just producing new knowledge, but also actors in making rights and claims on rights, which are their service dues or their, in this case, I was giving an example of toilets. But if the supply side is not willing to provide them toilets, they wouldn't have got toilets, So you have to assume a certain bona fide motivation on the part of the governance institutions. And in this era of populism, as you were talking about, we have this challenge in democracies because various tools of communication, including social media, etc., are being harnessed to what Gramsci used to say, hegemony. So a particular points of view, a particular orientation, but counter-hegemonic process also needs not another populist, but needs citizen engagement. How do you counter hegemony? And it's the study circles in the prisons of Gramsci's days, which really produced a counter hegemonic narrative. And our municipal commissioner was talking about counter narratives. Counter narratives are citizens' narratives. So it's not a fixed given. It varies because the relations of power are constantly being challenged and negotiated. The static status quo is irrespective of whether it is for good or for bad, is never a reality. So if citizens engage, and in cities particularly, given the diversity of resources and capacities of citizens, in a village, even today, you may be Dalit, you may be tribal, you may be Brahmin, you know relatively how to navigate with all your limitations. But in city, I don't know my neighbors. You don't know who else is there. We don't know how our maid lives. And so if the maid doesn't act collectively, then she won't be able to be heard. She won't be noticed. She won't become visible. We don't need pandemics to make our urban informers become visible.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Connected with that, let me also ask Rajesh sir also that, sir, we have seen, and rightly, sir, as you are mentioning the success of Swachh Bharat Mission, and now also PMAY in terms of number also, very good coverage, housing, sanitation, both has been a very strong, I would, sir, as you're highlighting the supply side, thrust is very important, and that really yielded from results. And so now we have around 5 years of Smart Cities Mission. We also have Smart Cities Observatory, all kind of debates also we know from administrators also, from practitioners also. And so that push really in terms of infrastructure, there are a lot of issues related to our capacity and ease of other things. But sir, what do you suggest in terms of participation? What should be as a supply drive in terms of institution or practices that can be adapted by all sort of local urban governments, be it council, be it corporations, or even those who are aspiring to become one, because every month our ministry updates 10, 20, 50 more cities, as you know, different. Now census 2021 will come, more will come. So, but what is happening within those cities, how a push as also supply driven can be given, and so what we can learn from the experiences of cities within India or from outside India, in your view, sir? One thing I really wanted to, because
Well,
yes.
you're rightly pointing out that if you just study Swachh Bharat Mission and you study its rural component, a year used to run around, and you study its urban component, there is a considerable difference in the process and seriousness of participation. Why? Because in rural context, participation started from community development days, and you have an institution like NIPSED around for 60, 70 years. But in the urban context, the component of participation in JNNU RM in 2005, component was strong, but was not taken seriously. And governance reforms were taken even less seriously, though they were supposed to be conditionalities for central funds to be made available. So then comes the smart city mission, and Bloomberg and others talked about participation. We were invited to do a toolkit by Bloomberg Foundation, and we produced a toolkit. But our team went in one of these meetings of smart cities when they were producing their proposals. In that meeting, there were more consultants than mayors or administrators. And urban development, unfortunately, has been driven by consultants. The amount of money that has been given to consultants in the last 40 years or 30 years of urban development, if that money was given to urban governments, municipalities, to build their own capacity, that would have become sustainable. Unlike any other program, you see, urban development has remained a consultant-driven program in India. And therefore, even the participation that was undertaken in the name of smart city planning, that was done by consultants most of the time. So, there is no question that a councillor, a mayor would like to be able to support their communities because they feel accountable. But the administrative side of the municipal infrastructure is very weak. The resources, the capacities are very weak. And unless we invest in them, we cannot, make inclusive urbanization. And you don't need a pandemic, please, for us to discover the tragedy of urban informals in the cities. We must treat them with dignity and respect and make the services available. And I believe that enough money is being made available, but it's not being targeted, utilized, and made inclusive, society for everybody, not just for a few of us.
Yeah, so one last query I really thought to ask you. Sir, our southern and western cities are very advanced. Some of the cities also have their own parastatal or their own infra body. But sir, when we look at some part of northeast, sir, there is so much of divergence. How do you see this phenomena emerging?
Well, the Tamil Nadu government, I was doing some training of health officials in late 80s, early 90s, 30 years ago. And Tamil Nadu government asked us, it was a Danida supported program, I remember. They asked us to also include in public health urban parts of Tamil Nadu. And in the FIRE program supported by USAID, Professor Vaidya would, of course, know the details better than me. In early 2000, late 90s, early 2000, Tamil Nadu government made double entry bookkeeping in all its urban bodies. And that double entry bookkeeping is not happening in UP Bihar urban bodies even today. So cities don't even know what assets or liabilities they have because everything is an expenditure or a revenue, nothing else. Now, the part of the problem is political. Part of the problem is also the population base. Growing urbanization of UP and Bihar has been handled by sending migrants out. The same thing has happened in Odisha. They would go to Surat or Tirupur and get their livelihood, but not in Odisha. So the political base, as Soumyadeep was saying in the beginning, the political base in Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, parts of, the political base has become very urbanized, and they have provided, seriously provided, urban livelihood possibilities there. And that has not happened in, and UP, Bihar governments are happy. It's like a remittance economy. They're happy with that. And that's why 40,000, 50,000 population panchayats continue. Instead of converting them into every block headquarter and every large village should be actually an urban node. And the tragedy of urbanization in India is that top 20 cities or top 30 cities have more than 60% or whatever, 50% of the urban population. It's highly centralized. So, the urbanization, if it was widely spread, UP Bihar can benefit greatly as well. But that's the problem. That's the difficulty that the political and administrative leadership of those states took cognizance of the relevance of urbanization and urban development policies, which unfortunately has not been done in the eastern and the northern hinterland part of the country.
Yes, thank you, sir. Also, urban cluster, so many industrial corridor, and so many schemes, everything also coming up. So, Soumyadeep sir, would you like to take up some questions?
Yes,
or
yes. I think
ask
there are a couple of questions, but I think one interesting question is from regarding the promotion of gender budgeting. So, yeah, will be the promotion of gender budgeting will be helpful in mainstreaming some of the women's needs and priorities and making the urban development truly inclusive. So that is one question which come up. It's in the Q&A box. And then another question is regarding the slum security. Like, should government provide some kind of slum security with affordable, accessible, and available with all the civic amenities? If that could be one way to make the cities inclusive. Your thoughts on all these things?
Well, we have been championing the case for that safe city is a smart city. And if it is not safe, I remember I've lived in Calcutta for a while, and I remember that Calcutta, I have good memories of Calcutta from a safe city point of view. I don't feel safe. Even as an elderly man in Delhi, I don't feel safe in Delhi. And the reason is that the concept of neighborhood and locality is much stronger in cities like Calcutta, in Mumbai as well. I have felt that way. Even what is called Navi Mumbai, that is, but not so in places like NCR here. The gender budgeting was introduced by Finance Minister Chidambaram. We worked on gender budgeting in several states. Our teams went around training people and all. But there was a problem. The problem is that most of the officials think gender budgeting means putting some money for women's program. No. Gender budgeting can be applied to Delhi Metro. How? Finding out what women need to be safe travelers in Metro. You don't need, gender budgeting doesn't mean, women taxi drivers, women security guards. This is the misconception. Misconception arises from the fact, let's give some, Beti Bachao campaign in Haryana cannot work. I have been saying it for 10 years, unless Beta Samjhao happens in Haryana. If you don't Samjhao Beta, Beti will never be safe. Don't focus on Beti only. Yes, give her education, give her livelihood opportunity, but Samjhao your Betas also. They are running as amok. So how will Betis be safe? So gender is a relational issue. It's a societal issue. It is not a women's issue. And that problem comes when you say gender budgeting, then you say, okay, we have got 10% money allocated for women's program. But that's not what it is. You have to ask the question, how this policy will affect women and men differently, and what can you do so that it is not doing any harm to them. It improves their access, improves their safety, improves their livelihood. the declining female participation rate in urban India is the best evidence of unsafe cities. It is the middle class. I joke, India has the highest number of professionally trained housewives in the world. PhDs, medical doctors, lawyers, engineers, financial, they're all sitting at home. And this is, and all economists say you increase your female labor participation rate by 5%, your GDP will go up by 0.5%. Wonderful. But that requires, focusing on what makes the city safe, what makes the city livable for all its citizens, particularly young girls. My daughter doesn't feel safe going around. I do feel anxious if she goes on her own in the night. So she says, Papa, what is the point in living here? I might as well shift to another city. But old man will be left alone. But that's a big question for making our cities livable and safe. They have to be safe. So many elderly, single old men or women get harassed and intimidated, and violent actions take place against them in places like NCR. That won't happen so much in Calcutta, I'm sure, even today.
Thank you very much again for your provocative way of visualizing cities as safe and giving a new way of looking at how we should conceive this very concept of gender budgeting. Nowadays, we generally, for example, being an economist, we generally try to think of gender budgeting as the conventional way, or that means, as you mentioned, like making money more and more available for women's program. But definitely, we need to look at this gender budgeting from a different perspective or point of view if we want to really make it effective and useful for the targeted population. So I think we are already running short of time. So now let me just quickly go to our chair, Dr. M. Ramchandran. So if you could make your some final comments.
Well, thank you once again. I don't think I should make it even longer, but it's interesting. Various points have come up, and these are critically relevant as far as the city governance systems are concerned. What we have neglected, what we have ignored, where we have failed, and what we need to take note of. But who will do this? That is the question. Will the political groups do it? Will those sections of society who need to take the lead, will they do it? These questions, I think, still remain unanswered. So it confirms my belief that the way governance happens at the city level, it needs to undergo a big change. It has to undergo a big change in the sense that it's not enough that cities have mayors, councillors, and commissioners and things like that, but it's a question of how really we take it down to the ground level and start from there. One, having information about all the people. Two, what the requirements are. Three, what is being done at that level. Is it really directly beneficial to all those who are living in that area, irrespective of whether one is better or worse off? More so in the case of those who do not have privileges and facilities. So I think that type of a change in the overall governance system has to come about. Professor Chetan Vaidya referred to an extreme example of Kerala. The question remains, if Kerala has been able to make this headway, why is it that other states are not taking the same route? What comes in the way, what stands in the way? So I think these deliberations will continue for quite some time. We may not get answers or the required solutions in the near future, but I suppose these deliberations will contribute to the process of bringing about a change which we need. And since Professor Chetan Vaidya referred to the Kerala example, there is also another example of a 2020 group, that is a group of professionals, non-politicians, who have started coming to power through the electoral process, and they bring about changes in the way governance happens, and they deliver at the ground level. They started with some villages. I don't know whether they have reached the municipalities level, but that is making a difference. So also whether going non-political at the local level would mean a lot for our cities and towns, that's also a question to be deliberated upon. I think with that I will stop. There are lots of points. If you are documenting these, I think all this will get listed, and this will lead to a larger discussion as to what is the direction we should be taking. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, IMPRI, Dr. Arjun, for the invitation and for giving me this opportunity of being part of this enlightening discussion. Thanks to the critical points Professor Rajesh Tandon has raised. We remain aware of this, but then we discuss and probably we leave it at that. How can that change be brought about? I hope that change can really come about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, joining us despite your busy and this important schedule. Also, sir also worked also for the Atmanirbhar Bharat push and also vocal for local, something we have done. I request everyone also to see. We also had sir's lecture on the topic. So shall we go quickly to since we have, yes, Professor Chetan Vaidya sir and also Professor Jyoti ma'am for half a minute, 1 minute for to give a way of forward sort of thing. Chetan sir. Some problem there. Jyoti ma'am, would you like to give your...
I resonate the point over here that it's very important that the consultant part of governing cities needs to go, and you need to have strong governance structures there. That is very much a need of the hour. And if that is there, otherwise lack of governance leads to a coming down of productivity. And that has its own economic, political, and social implications. Also, when you talk about participatory, then the people who have more negotiating skills tend to bring in much more that they feel would suit their agenda. And therefore, again, having a very strong governance system is absolutely the need of the hour, of course, but you need to have your agency collaborations too. But consultancy needs to really take a back seat on this. If we want to see Indian cities being among the top ranking cities in the future, and in the true sense of it being resilient, inclusive, and sustainable.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Samir sir, would you like to add anything?
I think he's not.
Sir is traveling.
Sorry.
Yes, please. Please.
Yeah, I think two takeaways for me in this discussion will be how to ensure a system which will allow the people to register themselves into the city framework. It can be done either by digital technologies, but yes, we know urban poor may not be a part of it. But relying essentially on political processes for the entirety of city experience, I feel may not be sufficient now. We will have to think of some newer ways and means of connecting the community. That was first takeaway. And secondly, of course, regarding the consultants, actually I have a mixed view on that, because international knowledge, experience, and younger professionals who are being a part of the city system, I think has also a positive fallout. It may not be always negative part of that. And for me, it will be a mixed bag, as far as their contribution is concerned. And it may not be fully correct to say that it was a total waste or they did nothing for that. So thank you, Arjun. These are my two limited takes on that.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So Rajesh, would you like to just give some concluding thought? Nevertheless, so thank you, everyone. Soumyadeep sir, would you like to propose?
Okay, yes, just my final thing is that being a student of economics, I always strive for finding the efficiency aspects of participation and all these things. Like I look forward, but the thing is, from today's discussion, what it appeared is that the participation is never going to be perfect, and we are still likely to exclude some people from the urban planning process. Still, including these community members in the urban planning process makes for better and more livable cities. And in this context, I find these great urbanist Jens Jacobs were very much encouraging. Like just I quote him, like cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. So that should be the way forward for us. So with this, now may I now request Arjun, Dr. Arjun, to formally.
Sir, you can give. Soumyadeep sir, go ahead.
Okay, so that's all from my side. Okay, so I'm really thankful on behalf of this Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at the Impact and Policy Institute in New Delhi, to all the participants of this web policy discussion, and especially also we are very much grateful to Dr. Rajesh Tandon for first for agreeing with for giving this talk, as well as for this very insightful presentation. And also we are thankful to our chair, Dr. M. Ramchandran, and all the panelists and discussions, Professor Chetan Vaidya, Professor Jyoti Chandraramani, and Mr. Samir Unale. And we are continuing with the State of City Conversation series. So we hope to have you in our next conversation series as well. So with this, once again, we are very much thankful to all of you, and we expect your encouragement, participation in all the future events of IMPRI. So that's all from my side, and have a very good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Yes, thank you, Ramachandran sir. Thank you, Jyoti ma'am. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.